What is art?
Art is...
Art is history.
What is art? That's a good question.
This is Art Uncovered,
Art is our collective cultural history.
a weekly podcast that brings you interviews with an eclectic mix of artists and creators.
Art is...
disappointing your parents.
I'm your host, Kimberly. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, we are honored to bring you episode 2 in this special 3-episode series focusing on fiber artists. This week, we spoke with Poppy DeltaDawn, a professor of weaving at the University of Kansas. Over the course of the conversation, we talk about the history of the loom and capitalism's effect on the weaver. We also talk about Poppy's practice and her exciting upcoming plans to raise sheep on the land that is operated by her university. Stay with us. Welcome back, listeners. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, I am so honored to be here with Poppy DeltaDawn. Poppy, so good to see you. I love seeing that you're in your studio space.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Listeners, if you're listening to this episode on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, I highly encourage you to take a look on YouTube because we could see a couple of looms and fun things in the background of Poppy's studio. And you're currently in your studio at University of Kansas where you're teaching, yeah?
Yep, true. At the University of Kansas in Lawrence, which is in Northeast Kansas, about about 45 minutes outside of Kansas City.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, at more towards the end of the conversation, I would definitely like to talk about your path to a tenure track position. But to start the talk, I'd like to talk about your artwork. So I recently read an article that you were interviewed in. It was published in Hyperallergic, and there was a really interesting quote in there that I would like you to kind of expand on for us. And you said that weaving is a human right. Can you expand on this for us?
Yeah, totally. The idea of weaving as a human right can be sort of hard to put into context when thinking about how many awful things are happening, especially in Palestine. But I think that weaving as a human right, what I think about are all of the kind of labor movements and all of the ways in which different states have sort of tried to get this knowledge away from people. Um, the idea of making your own cloth to for others to wear is kind of like a really beautiful notion. That's not quite what I'm doing. I'm not exactly making things for people to wear, but that is the implication. The idea of like cloth being like this sort of next to shelter and food. When you think about cloth, it's a thing that we need. We all wear every single day. Um, we all have, as humans, this kind of innate relationship to cloth. And so when you think about it like that, it's like, oh, well, cloth could be quite important, huh? And I always remind my students that we were spinning yarn as Neanderthals
Yeah, isn't that
50,000
amazing to
years
think?
ago. Yeah. And that means that we were making thread before we were human. Um,
I
that's
just got
that is so
goosebumps
wild
thinking
to
as
me.
well.
Like,
Yeah.
and so the idea of weaving is it for me it transcends cloth and the idea of making art or something. It's it's to make cloth is to be human. And so
Mm.
um, you know, there's a million different historic examples. I'm kind of like a geek when it comes to yarn and thread and history and
Yeah,
cloth.
share these examples.
Yeah, well, the biggest, maybe most glaring one for me, um, is Gandhi's Swadeshi movement, um, which is the idea that we can make our own stuff, right? In India, Gandhi was the figurehead of this boycott movement, um, and the idea was really to boycott product from England and make it so that Indian folks could support themselves and make their own clothing. And this is where the idea of like the spinning wheel as a symbol of resistance and agency and autonomy comes into play.
Mm.
And actually, for a few years, the spinning wheel was on the flag of India, which is just so beautiful to me. You know, another example would be like the Luddite movement. And a lot of us like know that word Luddite as sort of a pejorative term for those who are afraid of technology. But where it comes from is actually the Luddites were resistant to unadulterated efficiency and extraction of resources without considering the worker. And so the Luddite movement kind of emerged with the stockinette knitting frames, which was an early machine that was meant to make hose, like knitted hose, like or
Yeah,
like
yeah, like
leggings. Yeah.
stockings. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And so the Luddites would actually like destroy machinery like in the mills and the factories.
Now, would they
And
consider machinery the looms themselves or
yeah,
techno?
yeah, they would
Wow.
destroy the looms too. Um, and
Wow.
so this became such an issue that England made it a capital offense to destroy
Huh.
machinery, textile machinery
Mm,
specifically.
mm,
And
mm.
they executed people
Oh my
who
gosh.
were accused of destroying factory machinery. And they also exiled Luddites to Australia, where England was at the time running Australia as the penal colony.
Yeah.
And so these are just a couple, but I think about textiles as a way for the state to exploit us, the people, and us, the workers. But I also see textiles as a meaningful way to resist and
Mm.
wrestle our agency back. And I told you about some historical examples, but there are some really real current issues today.
Such as?
Um, well, one issue that comes to mind, you can read about this in the book Worn by Sophie Tannhauser, which is like
Okay.
a relatively new book, but she talks about how cotton growers in India are required to hand over each season's cotton seeds. So rather than collecting the seeds from this year's crop and planting them again next year, and continuing this sort of lineage of the plant, of the crop, the cotton seeds are swapped out for new genetically modified
That's
cotton
terrible.
seeds. And the cotton is not conducive, the kind of cotton is not conducive to the Indian continent. So it takes a lot of resources to grow in India. And so it needs a lot of water, it needs a lot of pesticides, it needs a lot of work. And it's not the right cotton for the place. And so I love this chapter from Sophie Tannhauer's book because I just think about this very thing in my life.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you because obviously this, you just proved in your speaking there that it's such a rich material to work with in terms of, meaning, historical meaning, social justice meaning, environmental meaning.
Yeah.
Um, Yet it's an art form that it's kind of rare, like it's to find a school that has textiles. Your school, Chicago, SAIC, I really don't know of too many others. So I'm curious how you came to find this art form. Was it that you were interested in kind of these ideas first, or did these ideas kind of come in your exploration of the material?
Yeah, that's a great question. And people always ask me how I like started making textiles.
Yeah.
Um, Part of it is chance, part of it is like luck and fate. Um, and I think that the other part is just like I feel like this is my has always been my calling.
Mm.
Um, and so I tell this kind of sad, kind of funny story. Can I be vulnerable?
Yeah, please, please. The mic is
Okay.
yours.
Well, I've said this in like lectures. I say this story in lectures, so it's not too vulnerable, but when I was a young girl, before I knew I was a young girl because I'm spoiler alert, trans. And so when I'm wrestling with my femininity and blossoming into like an
Mm.
adolescent girl, um, my mom taught me how to make a crochet chain, like a single crochet chain with a crochet hook and acrylic yarn, and I could not stop.
Wow.
She could not get me to stop. She never taught me how to attach individual chains together to make things, but she did teach me the chain, and I
Wow.
just kept making it. And I had noodles, like long, long, long noodles of crochet chain.
That's
I couldn't stop. I
adorable.
loved it. And I just remember feeling just so excited about how much I could do and the idea of like producing this thing that wasn't here before. Um,
Mm.
and one day we went to my grandma's house and my mom told me that I had to leave my crocheting in the car. And it was like shocked. I was like, what are you talking about? I want to show my grandma. I want to show everybody what I've been making. And
Yeah.
my mom was like, boys don't do this.
Oh no.
This is not a thing that this is for girls
Oh,
and
I'm
this
so
isn't for
sorry to
you
hear that.
and I'm sorry that I taught it to you. Like you can't really do this. And that was kind of um one of many times when people told me that it wasn't really allowed and it was not really a thing that we do anymore anyway. And
Mm.
so that was like my first experience into, I guess, listening, like feeling this like impulse or like an itch that I needed to scratch of like, oh my God, like these fingers can make things.
Wow.
And my dad was a carpenter and I really did not. I was terrified of his wood shop and he always wanted me
Mm.
to do stuff in the wood shop and I have overcome my fear of wood shops, but I just have always felt this kind of ancestral calling, a sort of
Mm.
like this is embedded in me. Like I feel like I had a memory within my body. My fingers had a muscle memory.
Mm.
Like I felt this calling to make cloth before I knew what cloth was.
Mm.
And have found that that's not unique. A lot of people have that feeling, and not probably not just about cloth. Um, and so, but to answer your question in a less poetic way,
No, I
um,
love the poetic version.
I I went to a public arts high school in Baltimore, where I'm from, and I just happened to have this really amazing art school in my backyard, the Maryland Institute College of Art, or
Mm.
MICA.
Micah, yeah.
Um, and I kind of always knew I was going to MICA because it was in my backyard. Like I didn't
Hmm.
have to travel. I'm come from kind of a lower income um, community, and going to fancy art school was like so wild. But a bunch of us public school kids from Baltimore did because it was right there, and all of our teachers went there, and so I bring that up though because it just so happens coincidentally slash fatefully, Micah has like an unrivaled, unparalleled fiber program for
Incredible.
undergraduate study. And so I got there with all of this real drive and passion to make things
Mm.
with fiber, but my professors there clued me in on a little bit of maybe why I have this drive or
Wow.
something, and the
Wow.
context around what we make. And so yeah, that's kind it's and the rest is history. And I always say this
Mhm.
short story is I saw a loom and I was like, I am going to use that thing.
That's great. There's so I would like to talk about your work a little bit because in talking we mentioned quite a bit about clothing, but your making of cloth is, to my understanding, you're not making clothing, right? You're making. How would you describe them? Would they be? Are they functional in your mind? Are they wall pieces? Are they technology? Are they tools? Like, how would you
Yeah,
present them?
they're all of those things.
Yeah.
They're all
I'm
of
gonna do a
those.
screen share if you don't mind of your
Oh, sure.
website
Yeah, that would be great actually.
while we
Just so
chat
we
about your work.
they I think of them as all of what you said. So they are wall piece, like a lot of them are wall pieces. It's also kind of I'm really multidisciplinary, and even though a lot of my work is sort of like starting from the idea of a sort of cultural, historical, and labor context around textiles and cloth, even though I start there, a lot of my work are many different things. Um, the samplers, though, are maybe like what people talk about most when they talk about my weaving, and they are experiments. They are records of tests and the result of asking what happens when I do this, and what happens when I combine these two materials, and what happens if I use this one weave structure in combination with that one. And so I think of them as like a really fertile ground for possibility within my work. A lot of times they're a starting off point to a much larger conversation or body of work. I consider through my work the lineage of knowledge building. The story that I told you about my mom teaching me how to how to crochet, is not unique to what all of my work is, which is like, I just learned how to do this thing. Now I want to get really good at it. And I also want to make art. I don't want to just learn how to do the thing. I want to make art about learning how to do the thing. In the beginning, I got really nervous about making work that is meant to be vulnerable or meant to be half of a sentence. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
Like sort of fragments of fully formed thoughts
And
or
you were
something.
nervous to kind of present it as an experiment in process.
Yeah, but like they're also the it's complicated because the objects themselves are not in progress when I show them. Like they're
Oh,
done,
brilliant.
but the ideas are in progress,
Mm.
which
Mm.
is true for all art, right? Should be.
100%. Yeah, I was, yeah.
But like it's scary to put these samples out and say they're not done.
Mm.
Like, and you're not supposed to think of them as a thesis, a, a declaration necessarily. They're supposed to be a fragment and like meanderings. And I've thought
Mm.
of them as choose your own adventures in the past. Um, and and I think that this idea of like the sampler being this like, oh yeah, like what happens like with this and this and this and this together? Maybe like it's like a word bank, like a lexicon, like a kind of like, oh, like Donald Duck plus double weave plus shiny yarn plus wool equals, I don't know yet. Like I like this kind of um putting all of the important things or related things or maybe unrelated things in one piece and thinking of like four different poems or
Oh, I
something
love it. And
visually.
as you were talking there, I'm actually going to do another screen share quick of your website because listeners, I highly encourage you to look at Poppy's website on a desktop computer because it's a totally different experience. What you will notice if I do this screen share here is that I am an active participant in how these different pieces are arranged, right? So if I click in the sampler here, I have the ability to move this weave next to this one and see what type of conversation happens there, or if I only have those two in view, what happens when these two are put together. So it's really asking quite a bit from, not asking in a bad way, but it's encouraging the viewer to become, yeah, just an active participant in the telling of a story or the telling of connections. It's so brilliant. And
Thank
it's
you so
very
much.
satisfying being able to move these images on your site. It's so wonderful.
No, I really appreciate that you know,
Yeah.
I um you're like maybe the first person who's really like called to attention this like parallel between what I did on the website and like what I'm saying. It's true. Like I'm
Yeah.
asking you to kind of plug and play or something. Um
Yeah, I think this could be a good point to kind of talk about what you referred to before we started recording as a digital loom, because it's this kind of again combination of yeah, I guess the digital versus I don't know if traditional tools is the right way to phrase it. But before we spoke, I did not know that something called a digital loom existed. It feels like an oxymoron a little bit. So, can you tell us a little bit about this tool, your interest in the tool, how you use it, et cetera, et cetera?
Oh my gosh, okay, I'm gonna try to not make you regret you asked that question. I'm just like so into it and such a nerd, but it's important for me to frame the conversation around weaving and cloth production around, again, not jargony, expert, industry, factory, mill, warehouse, like kind of world. It's important to me that we all think about weaving as this accessible and human activity, which we're all a part of. And so, um, that all being said, it is a mouthful. And so I guess I just wanted to talk about jacquard first. So the jacquard loom was invented by Joseph Marie Jacquard in 1804. And Napoleon bought the loom from jacquard. And it was really invented to de-skill weaving, to
Oh,
make
interesting.
weaving more efficient and cheaper, and make it so that we could clothe the world, sort of. And I mean, that sounds really positive, right? Like it's
It
really like
does in
it's
some ways, yeah.
really an accessible and important thing for people to have access to cloth. But what do you think the weavers thought about the idea of making weaving so efficient?
That's
So,
a great question. What did they
yeah,
think? Were they
well, you know, the
scared for
idea
their
of,
jobs?
yeah, I mean, in a generation, like it completely like decimated like the the industry of textiles. And it wasn't just the jacquard. Like I I'm not trying to like paint Joseph Jacquard as a supervillain, even though it's hard for me not to think of him like that. Um, because he was a businessman, an inventor. He was never a weaver. So one important thing to know is just that there was a loom that sort of did the same thing that the jacquard did. The draw loom. So there was a draw loom before the jacquard, and the draw loom, rather than having the loom mechanically select the threads by the weaver to lift. Rather than having the loom do that from the weaver's perspective, the draw loom needed a second operator. So it's pretty intense, but if you can imagine, there was the weaver weaving the draw loom, and this is for the draw loom is like
Oh my
it
gosh, I
made
think I
these,
found a picture. Let me see if
yeah, it
let me
made
do
these
this.
fancy like damasks, which are like kind of think of it as like pictorial weaving. Like,
Is
yeah,
this what we're
that's
thinking of?
exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
It looks like a playground.
Yeah. And so what you're seeing right now is
Wow.
the person's
Okay.
sitting down in the front.
Yep.
She might be calling to the other person, lift this thread,
Oh
this
my
thread, and
God.
this thread. And then that person
Wow.
and their official job title back in 1804, they were the draw boy. So that was their name. And that many times
Wow.
they were boys, but often they were, older. And and so they would kind of take orders from the Weaver.
Wow.
And it was this tandem kind of performance operation. And
And this was before the jacquard, which became
yes,
okay, so very skilled labor prior to the jacquard.
very skilled labor prior to the jacquard, and also very, very, very long labor. So
Right,
imagine
right,
like
right, right.
having like a big, beautiful draped silk damask, I don't know, curtain. Like imagine the curtains in the Palace of Versailles, you know? These were all made
Yeah, wow.
probably on a draw loom. Um, and
Wow.
so if you just think about like having these giant pieces of cloth and having to make them all line by line and saying, now lift this one, or I don't know how they would
Yeah,
do it,
yeah, yeah. Oh
but
my
I'm
gosh.
not a historian. I am an artist. But
Yeah,
but
yeah.
um but
Wow.
to imagine like how long that took, it does it bears saying. I have to say that the draw loom was developed thousands of years ago in China and traveled the world from there. But it's just so exciting. It's thrilling to me to think that what we make now on the digital loom could have been made in 1804
Yeah, wow.
without a computer, and it could have been made in 17, 16, 15, 1404 without a punch card
Yeah,
loom, which is what
wow.
the Jacquard was. It uses punch cards. And so for this reason, it is so magical that the Jacquard is actually only, it was invented in 1804.
Yeah,
It's
wow. So it was a
so new
long time.
still.
It
Well,
was a
it's
long
long
time of
and new, but but
well, it was a long history of the draw loom before, so it's relatively short using these kind of more what word would you use to describe them? Like more, in today's technology we say user friendly.
yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, user friendly. It's true. It's
Yeah.
and part of all of this is just like the insidious sort of strategies of capitalism, which is to alienate us all from labor, and also it's to silo all of the workers. So the digital TC2 loom, the TC2 is the model um, of the
Digital
loom. The
digital
T,
TC2.
yep, and the TC2 loom, which was made by this Norwegian company called Tron Road, these looms were invented by a Norwegian weaver named Vika Vestby in the 1990s. And
In the
it's,
1990s.
yes,
Wow.
and it's important. It bears discussion because prior to this, there were essentially no commercially available avenues to use jet card technology as a hand weaver. So Jacquard looms are almost exclusively industry looms. And that's to say, in a mill where you weave, weavers generally don't use their hands. The loom weaves it for you. So there are different kinds of mechanisms that actually like shoot the weft yarn, the yarn that we weave with through
Mm-hmm.
the warp, it weaves it itself. And so,
Wow, weird.
um, using like a technology, it's essentially like a big hand that like it's a hook slash hand that carries the weft yarn to the center of the loom, and then another hand on the other side comes over and grabs it,
No way. It's
and
so,
brings it
it's
back the
like an
other way.
alien.
hmm And with this like it's called rapier technology,
Hmm.
Rapier. With this technology, we're able to weave like we as in the human race is
Society, yeah.
able to weave like over 800 weft threads a minute.
No, shut up. No, like,
And that is not the weaving I'm interested in.
yeah, wow.
We don't need to make things so fast.
Mm.
Um, this is the part that is the troublesome part. It's like we went from 0 to 100, like in like, I don't know, 100 years. And it's not just about labor relations and ethic and human rights. It's also about like the waste, right? Like we didn't
Yeah.
even like talk about the waste. There are just so many ramifications of the mass production that we've inherited. And that's kind of what my work is sort of talking about. And I talk about the TC2 because Vivica Vespi, I think of her as my hero because what she did was wrestle, like steal, like take the technology of Jacquard, take it back. She took it back and gave it back to the hand weavers. We now, like, for the first time, have this capability in our actual hands. And I'm just thinking a lot about how this specific moment is so special because I'm actually weaving with my hands with a shuttle and a bobbin of yarn, and I'm able to stop the loom and go backwards and go forwards and change out the file and there's just this kind of reuniting or something.
Wow.
And so it's really like a very unique moment because there's like this slippery, what is it? Like, is it a hand weaving? Is it a machine? Is it machine woven? And it's like, yes, it's both. And I think that we have to talk more about that.
Yeah. So
And
so you use this digital loom, but in a so how do you insert your own hand back into it? Is there like an auto button that you turn off? Like how
the loom doesn't weave it for me. I weave it. So, we weave it with
so
our
what
hands.
does the digital loom
The loom
accomplish?
lifts the threads. So
So it's that
the
extra
loom,
hand.
it's the draw boy,
Yeah,
the person
exactly.
at the
Yeah,
top of the loom.
yeah.
Yeah, it's the extra hands. You're right.
Wow.
And so
Oh.
what the loom is, I mean, you can also weave with a draw loom. And you can do that without an extra person. There are looms that have like Um, this is like on my list of things to do, which, as you can imagine, is really long. But I am planning on using a draw loom sooner or later. But there are different ways to do this. But like the jacquard is a hybrid. I
Yeah, it
think a
sounds it.
lot. I frame it as to students and in writing and in my own work. I think of it as a subversion or a perversion of what Jacquard wanted. And that's kind of why I'm like, oh, what Vivek Vespi did and what hand weaving with Jacquard technology does, it's like, no thank you, Napoleon. We will we will take it back now and
Yeah.
we will create meaning with it in art, and we won't worry about creating a wealth of stuff. We're going to create a lineage of knowledge now and kind of make up for the last 200 years where hand weavers were kind of like shut down. I guess I want to say, just for your for your history and Industrial Revolution and weaving nerds out there, that I
Yeah.
am using broad brushstrokes here, and it's a little more complicated than what I'm saying, but not by much.
Yeah.
And like that's a good time for me to say like I'm going to Italy this summer
Mhm.
for a weaving residency where I will
Fun.
use turn of the century jacquard punch card looms for the first
Nice.
time.
For the
And
first time.
so yeah, and so
Nice.
I'm gonna be going and like making, hole punched cards to put in the jacquard, and that's a hand loom, and so
Amazing.
it's not like it's impossible. It's just the like digital technology though is new for the weaver outside of the mill. And my
So true.
students like they blow me away because like
Yeah.
this technology is really new for artists, and I want to make it really accessible. Um, and for years now, I've been trying to figure out the best, most clear, most accessible way to teach people about structure within weaving. Because like, you have the ability with the TC2 to kind of think of it as a printer or something. Like
Yeah,
you
totally. It sounds like a
can
2D printer. Yeah.
yeah, like you can just kind of do a plug and play and like assign whatever structures you want to make it look like a beautiful image without with as little structure showing as possible. Like that's
Hmm.
allowed and possible and easy. But but what I need to do for myself and for all the things that I told you about today
Hmm.
is to bring the loom back to the loom.
Mm.
And
And your students are receptive to that? They don't want to take the easy way out?
it's a little bit of both, right? Like we want to see Daffy Duck in a weaving. Like, hey, I want that. I want to be able to see Daffy Duck in a weaving. Like that's amazing. But like part of the reason it's amazing is because we're seeing Daffy Duck because we're manipulating structures to make a Daffy Duck. Like
Right, right,
make a
right.
Daffy Duck structure, a Daffy Duck room within the textile. Like that is
So,
like leagues more interesting than an illusion of Daffy Duck. Um,
100%.
and
Yeah.
and so it's like, how can we make this is so funny. How can we make the weaving become Daffy Duck? And and yeah, like I to do that, we have to actually go back to basics. Like, what is a twill? What is a satin weave? What is a plain weave? And go from there. Um, because that's what it is. Like, we're not reinventing the wheel. We're tapping into thousands of years of knowledge and lineage
Mm-hmm.
that
Hmm.
you alluded to earlier in our conversation. A lot of schools have divested in and um,
Yeah.
closed up their textile programs because we don't do textiles physically. We don't do textile design physically in a lot of ways in the United States. Textile design is a computer job by and large. And the textiles program here at KU used to be a textile design program, and we have a lot of remaining infrastructure and equipment of that old textile design program. We have hundreds of books of sample swatches and
Wow.
patterns and stuff for when textile design was implemented by hand weaving. But, you know, as we've become more and more of a globalized economy, um, and workforce, um, we've divested a lot of the physical making of cloth in North America and put it in places in Asia and other places in the world, and so a lot of schools just kind of shrugged and wiped their hands of it and sold off all their looms. but some schools had a little more foresight, and I
Mm.
think now that it seems like there are some programs who are like really sad that they don't have looms and stuff, and
Yeah,
I'm
rightfully
just
so.
like, thank God the loom survived here at
Yeah,
KU.
yeah, yeah.
And so, but there is like this big conversation happening, undeniable conversation happening around fiber art. But I think that it's really important for me to keep saying like that fiber art's important because it's related to a translation of culture and textiles just like I said earlier, they're a human thing and they're records of what has happened here and they're records of where we've been.
So, Poppy, do you mind sharing with us what you're currently working on? I know you mentioned that you're going into residency. Do you have the ability to share, yeah, your current practice?
Oh yeah, so I guess since moved to Kansas from New York and then Chicago, I've been going west, right? I've been like I
Mm.
started from New York and got to Chicago for a year for my visiting professorship at SAAC, and
Oh,
then
nice.
just moved here in August to start this appointment. And I had never been to Kansas, but I when I got here, I was just kind of floored. I feel like I naively like just didn't know how much was happening out here. And also I I knew this intellectually, but on the ground, I don't think I realized just how recent the sort of genocide of indigenous people happened. Um,
Mm.
and just the kind of formation of like the settler state here in the Midwest. I just kind of feel like I was living under a rock in New York. And I just say that because when I started out here, I had this sort of grand plan to get a flock of sheep. Um, in order to
To
make
shoot, yeah,
cloth,
yeah, yeah,
um, to make cloth from the flock of sheep. And I've been talking about this for many years, and it's still gonna happen. But when I got here, things got really complicated. I kind of like realized that you don't just get cloth, like you don't just get fleece. You like the fleece doesn't just appear on the sheep. The sheep need to eat something. You have to take care of the sheep.
yeah.
Um, and so like I'm like, okay, I get here and I'm like, all right, like I'm gonna get some sheep. And what? Like sheep feed? Like what do sheep eat? Like sheep
Sheep
pellets?
feed.
Like yeah, like sheep kibble and bits, like um and so I'm like as I'm thinking of like this really big question of like, well, what do the sheep eat? Um,
Yeah.
Back to the question, like, well, will sheep eat grass and hay? But like, what does that mean? Like, what is, I'm sorry, this is like a really funny question, but like, what is grass? What is hay? And I just like kept doing this, right? Like saying like, okay, like, yeah, I'm gonna have a sh flock of sheep to spin the wool. I already spin the wool in some of my work and I already do everything, but I'm like from when I get the fleece, but I think that this kind of question of like how to have fleece or like where the fleece comes from and what are the sheep, how are they nurtured, like those all kind of opened up this giant can of worms. Um, in a previous conversation that we talked about, like I sort of like make implications or references to like cloth being trans or something, or like transmutation of fleece going from like thread or like from like wool from the sheep's body to the yarn to the cloth to our body. Like it's kind of it transitions like, and I
Mm.
think a lot about the raw material of the body like becoming the thing to nurture our bodies. Like I've been thinking about that for a long time, but I guess when I got here and I asked the question, like, what do the sheep eat? I had this kind of moment where I realized that, like, they're the land, they eat the land, and therefore the cloth is the land, is therefore like, oh, we know all of this maybe intellectually, but like, we are what we eat. This is the thing that people have been shouting from the top of their lungs. And so I'm like, I feel like I finally
Wow.
heard,
Mhm.
oh, we are our place. And whatever you feed the sheep, the cloth will be. And that's not just
Wow.
in terms of quality, but it's in terms of like, if you feed it something shitty, it's going to be something shitty.
Yeah. So no
If you
kibbles.
Yeah, or if you feed it exploitation, like it's
Yeah,
just
wow.
gonna come from a place of like exploitation. And if you feed it factory farmed food or whatever, like it's gonna be factory farmed
Mm.
fleece.
So what's your
And
resolution? Kind of coming to this understanding.
oh, thank you. Thank you for cutting me off and asking me like no, I really appreciate it. I need someone to keep me on the rails here. Um, keep me on the guardrails. So that's all just to say that I'm currently cultivating a native hay meadow. Um, and I'm going to um after we finish the restoration of the hay meadow, I'm gonna scythe it all down with my body and a scythe and make hay. And eventually I'll have sheep and
How much land, like how big is your meadow?
it's 2 acres.
Wow, that's a lot
The
of
The University of Kansas has this amazing research facility called the KU Field Station
work.
that has like thousands of acres of land that researchers, including myself, at the university have access to
Wow, incredible.
for our
So the land
students
belongs to, well,
to the
it's now
university.
run by the
To
university.
endowment, yeah.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of, because this is a Research One university, we have a lot of researchers in ecological restoration and other fields like indigenous studies and pyrogeology and all of these like fields that
Mhm.
acknowledge the work and the stewardship and the knowledge that indigenous communities
That's
have
amazing.
have afforded us and the land. and
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I've been thinking a lot about my role as a settler here in Kansas, and I've been thinking a lot about the analogies between what's happening here and what's happening in Palestine. And it's really affecting, and it goes like way, way, way beyond cloth. But I think that cloth is such a beautiful and perfect and real example of where the land is now and how we can save it.
Well, Poppy, thank you so much for sharing your immense amount of knowledge and passion. And it was an honor to learn from you. And yeah, your students are very lucky. So thank you for sharing that with us here.
Thank you so much. I hope that I didn't um ramble too much. I just get,
Oh, it's
when
great.
we talk about weaving, I'm just like, oh, I do not have to keep the filter on anymore. Weaving, got plenty to say.
All right, listeners, that's all for this week. Please be sure to tune in next week to catch our third and final episode in this 3-part series focusing on fiber artists. Next week, we will be speaking with Sam Dienst about her path to becoming a weaver and the tools she uses to sustain her practice. Hope to see y'all then. Have a safe week. Bye bye.